we such terrible writers, and how can we fix this? Benjamin Dreyer will be here to discuss his best-selling guide to writing, Dreyer's English. What makes for a great Washington novel? Thomas Mallon will be here to talk about his latest book, Landfall. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Benjamin Dreyer joins us now. He is the copy chief of Random House and the author of a new book, already a bestseller, Dreyer's English, an utterly correct guide to clarity and style. Benjamin, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with something very basic, which is, what is a copy editor? How is it different from an editor and a proofreader? What is it?
Well, the editor, and that's what I call those people too, the editor, that's the person who acquires the book for the house and squires it through however many drafts it takes until it's generally happily decided that the book is ostensibly finished. And that's, of course, that's big work of, arcs and pace and characterization and all the things that go into turning a very good idea for a book into a great idea for a book. But when it is finished, that's when it needs to be copy edited. And copy editors do a host of things. There's the rudimentary checking to make sure that everything is spelled correctly, making sure that the homophones are untangled. If it's a novel, you're keeping an eye on continuity issues, basic things like ensuring that if somebody is speeding up 8th Avenue, they are in fact speeding north on 8th Avenue instead of speeding south on 8th Avenue. And you're also doing, I'd say, more artful things like keeping an eye on an author's penchant for certain words. All authors have pet words. They all have different pet words. But if you like that word, you're apt to use it a number of times. And a copy editor is keeping an eye open for that. You're also keeping an eye open for inadvertent rhymes. And then sometimes sentences are just tangled up and they need to be untangled. And maybe there are 4 important chunks of information in a sentence, and they might work if instead of being laid out as 1, 2, 3, 4, it was 1, 4, 3, 2, and the sentence will make more sense and it'll be more effective. And when it goes well, authors feel very supported and loved, and they feel that somebody is looking out for them. And that's the copy editing. And then the author gets the chance to review the copy editing, respond to the copy editing, accept some suggestions, reject some suggestions. And then you get to typeset pages, and that's when the proofreaders come in. And proofreaders, essentially, it's this is right, this is wrong, and you're making sure that no little errors either crept into the text or things that have gotten past everybody because everybody was looking slightly in the other direction. And then if it works correctly at the end of the process, you publish a book that has absolutely no mistakes in it, and that can happen.
You make it sound like such a gentle and loving process and relationship between the author and the copy editor and the copy editor and the editor. But not to say that this would ever happen in my case, but it has been known that writers will get annoyed at copy editors for, taking out their style and their voice and for stubbornly adhering to the rules or for taking out their voice. And then on the other hand, as an editor, you might think that the copy editor is overstepping his or her boundaries and having opinions about things that go well beyond the confines of writing and grammar. Does this ever happen?
Yes, it does. When I was a much younger copy editor, and perhaps this comes of being less certain of your skills than perhaps you ought to be, I'm sure I had a great sense of this is right and this is wrong, and I'm going to fix what I think is wrong. And authors will push back, as sometimes they do, because it's their book and they wrote it the way they wanted it. I have learned over the years, and as copy chief of a whole department now, I try to work with my colleagues to make sure that this notion infuses everybody's thought. You are there as the copy editor, not to turn a manuscript into what you think is a good book, but to turn the manuscript into the best possible version of the manuscript that you can help make it. Most authors really do love good copy editing, and I hit the word good really hard because it has to be good copy editing.
Right.
It has to be a copy editor who listens. It has to be a copy editor who gets what's going on the page. There have been examples of impertinent copy editing along the lines of a copy editor suggesting to a writer, I don't think the character would do that. That's not a good moment.
Right. I'm curious, as the copy chief of Random House, as the head honcho, are you the keeper of the standard? Are you the one that says, you know what, house style now for Random House, we're officially taking that capital out of internet, or we are making website into one word, or we are going to start accepting this particular use of this other word?
When I arrived at Random House back in 1993, the first thing that I was taught, and I really sort of liked this, and to some extent it is still true and it always has been true, which is that Random House has no house style.
It's random.
It's completely random. Every day somebody will call me on the phone and say, can I ask you a random question? And they don't mean it. But it's just like, yes, you can always ask me a random question. We have no house style with one single exception. We have the house style that most book publishers have and most journalists do not have, which is the mandated use of the series or serial or Oxford comma.
I knew we were going to fight about this.
We were going to get to that sooner or later.
Do you just grit your teeth while reading the New York Times every day, or how does that work?
I love reading the New York Times. I've been reading the New York Times my whole life, and I know that you have your house style and we have our house style, and certain magazines have their famous house styles, and I can read something without the series comma just fine.
You know, it's interesting, too, that you call it the series comma because other people refer to it only as the Oxford comma, which you're not doing. I'm assuming that's also – I feel like every choice you make with words must be very deliberate. So,
yes.
So why – explain for listeners some of whom are not in this country and don't necessarily know what we mean when we talk about this particular comma.
This particular comma is the one that comes before the last item in a list. So, for instance, the series or serial or Oxford comma is the one when you are talking about apples, comma, bananas, comma, and cherries. It's the one that comes before and cherries. Now, adherents of the Oxford comma, series comma, serial comma, use it for, among other things, to make certain that it doesn't appear as if the last two items in the series have some particular special relationship, that they are not themselves a pair, they are two individual things. Other people will look at that and think it's simply not necessary.
So you sound very calm and reasonable here, but let me quote from your book, which says, only godless savages eschew the series comma.
I'm not averse to hyperbole when I figure I can get a laugh out of it.
Have you been saying sort of all along to yourself, like, one day I'm going to put this all in a book? Or like, how did this come to you, the decision to take all your wisdom and put it down in Dreyer's English? I
had spent a long time very happily being a copy editor. I had in my 20s, I had done some dabbling in writing. I was doing a little bit of film and theater criticism, and I wrote, I think, a grand total of 2 short stories. And I rather liked doing it, but it just wasn't working the way I wanted it to, and particularly insofar as fiction was concerned, I suddenly developed a monstrous block, and I decided that rather than be in pain every day of my life, I would find something else to do. And I found myself accidentally doing proofreading work and then copy editing work and then coming to Random House. And I was quite happy doing that. We have this departmental memo in which we keep certain, not rules and regulations, but things that get, lists of things that get past everybody that we want to make sure aren't getting past
What's
everybody.
on the list?
Oh, everything from making sure that you spell Katharine Hepburn's first name with the A in the middle and not the E. A common understanding of how we do title treatment for newspapers. We follow masthead style. Whatever it is that's on the actual masthead, that's on the front page, we set in italics. So you keep track of that sort of thing. The difference between the New York Times and, let's say, Chicago Tribune, which does not properly have a "the" at the beginning of it. So, things like that. And then just sort of things like the past tense of lead is not spelled L-E-A-D, it's spelled L-E-D. And if I see it wrong in a book one more time, there's going to be trouble.
So you settled into this copy editing role.
And then, of a sudden, it occurred to me that I wanted to think about writing again. In fact, I remember I was in Los Angeles with my husband, and we were having New Year's Eve dinner, and I said, I want to write again. I think I'm going to write every day. I'm going to make a promise to myself I'm going to write every day. And I was just writing sort of little things. And then all of a sudden, it did occur to me, I want to write a book, and this is the book that I want to write. I have all these tricks up my sleeve, and I think I have something to bring to the conversation that nobody else has. I mean, there are all sorts of wonderful style books and books about etymology, which I love to read about.
What are your favorites?
I like Woe Is I, and I love a book by Theodore Bernstein called Miss Thistlebottom's Hobgoblins, which is really one of the best books about being in the trenches with writing and how it works that I ever read. I think it's out of print, but you can find copies of anything these days. But I thought I do have things to say that I think haven't been said, and they weren't simply about remembering what's right and remembering what's wrong, but they were particular things that I, as a copy editor, bring to the page that I thought I could share. And I figured that the book might be certainly of interest to other people who do editorial work. And I thought, well, it might also be of interest to writers. And then, as I was discussing it with my employers, who eventually decided to publish the book, because the book's published by Random House, there's a great big swath of humanity that is simply interested in what yet one more self-appointed expert thinks about that comma. Mm-hmm. And we're going to see if we can enchant those people.
So it's interesting. Your alternate occupation for you was always writer. You did not want to be what some people outside this world might assume would be the next logical step, which is to be an editor.
Right. That's a completely different brain. I listen sometimes to the editors in the house talking about what they're doing as they're working on manuscripts. And to my ears, it sounds like some astonishing alchemy. I mean, it's like I just listen with my eyes popping, because they do different things and they think in a different way. My talent, if I can call it that, is, stop being coy, Benjamin. My talent is to work on a nuclear level, to really just get down to sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. And of course, I'm looking at the big pictures. I'm working on a manuscript. But my job is to, is polish it down to the commas and the words and the syllables.
The interesting thing about this book one interesting thing about the book is that it was an instant runaway New York Times bestseller, which maybe isn't obvious to everyone that a book about writing style and grammar would instantly hit the list. I mean, were you surprised?
I was shocked. I was completely shocked. I recognized a number of months ago, sometime before the book went to the printer, that I had written a good book. I knew that. I was confident in that, and I didn't need to be told it twice a day to be certain of it. Like, you wrote a good book, and I was like, okay, good. And I hoped that it would go out into the world and it would find some favor. I simply didn't anticipate that what happened was going to happen. I mean, certainly a few people wrote some very lovely things about the book as it was getting ready to go on sale, including your own Sarah Lyle, who wrote a very sweet profile of me. But I couldn't have anticipated that this was going to happen. I
mean, it went to like number 6 on Amazon?
It was as high as 2.
Number 2.
At Amazon for a few lovely hours. And the book in the number 1 spot was Michelle Obama's book. And then, hitting the Times bestseller list, which was just delightful.
Is it that we all just want to be told what to do? Like, we all want some rules already? Is it that people are confused by the total absence, or not absence, but just complete overturning of all rules on social media with regard to writing? Like, why this book right now?
Well, I think, and I really want to make this point, especially about social media, because I think that some people who are perhaps eager to misconstrue what I think that I think that texting without periods is evil, and that the way people write on Twitter is bad. I love Twitter, and I like to speak in Twitter when I'm on Twitter. And I use the letter U when I'm texting instead of the word Y-O-U, because I'm texting.
But do you use exclamation points?
I do, because the one thing that I have certainly learned, and I have used more exclamation points at Twitter and in texting in the last 2 weeks than I would allow to be used in 50 books over the course of the years. There is the thing, and it's true, if you're texting or if you're tweeting and you don't use an exclamation point, there can be a certain kind of chilly sound about it, as if you don't really mean what it is. So, what the hey, use the exclamation
very standoffish not to use the exclamation point on Twitter, and it's leaked over into email as well. I mean, it's obnoxious to just put in a period at this point. It's like a slap in the face.
There's a Twitter vocabulary, and if if you're when in Twitter, speak like the Twitterers do, and I think that's just fine. So setting all that aside, because really my beat is prose. My beat is published prose, and my concern is not it has to be right, and I don't even know what that means, so I don't want to dare to say, it has to be right. I think that prose should be effective. I think that prose should be clear. I think that, to use what I always say about a good sentence, if a reader is halfway through the sentence and has to double back to the beginning of the sentence because some piece of punctuation set the reader in the wrong path, or a word that you thought was a verb is a noun, or the other way around, that sentence needs a little fixing.
Everyone has their pet peeves. One of mine is the word utilize, which is overused. How do you feel about the word utilized?
There are times when to use the word utilize in the sense of to use effectively is the right word, but more often than not, use does everything that a word needs to do. We all have pet peeves. I have mine, you have yours, everybody has different ones. I wouldn't trust anybody who was in the word business, who didn't maintain a few irrational beliefs. You have to choose them. I think you should sort of set a numerical limit. Okay,
mine was rational. What are your irrational?
My irrational beliefs include that saying I could care less is a particularly delightful, perhaps, I always think of it as sort of an East Coast urban kind of Jewish way of expressing sarcasm, and the more people rail against it, and people go positively red in the face over it. So the more people do that, the more I dig in, and I like to use it myself. There are some points that I'm very sort of stiff-necked about, but at other points I really do try to hold to the notion that this is a party and we're playing, and that's what language is about, and you need to be playful and you need to have a good time, so have a good time.
Who was the poor person who had to copy edit your book?
The poor person who had to copy edit my book was a copy editor that when I was a production editor at Random House years ago, when I was working on books, book by book by book, I used to hire her all the time. She's just spectacular, just thoughtful and a great ear. And I asked that she be hired to copy edit my book, and she expressed that she was honored, and she expressed that she was somewhat intimidated. And what I said was, look, do what you do. The last thing I need anybody to be doing to me in this particular book is to be deferential to me. It has to be good. It has to go out right. There have to be no great inadvertent stupidities in it. And please help me, help me. And she was wonderful. She did everything for me that I have always tried to do for writers. She was supportive. She kept an eye on my bad habits, including a penchant for somewhat tangled sentences and perhaps a bit more joy in parentheses than needs to be done 5 times on a page. But she would also, every now and then, she would laugh in the margins at one of my jokes, which made me happy.
What was her laugh sign?
Oh, it was just ha. She would just write ha.
I like the ha or just the exclamation point.
An exclamation point is a lovely thing. One thing that was great was that when she thought that something needed to be rephrased, either because it was awkward or because I had perhaps phrased it very similarly, she would do what copy editors often do, which was to not simply say, oh, you said this, but to say, you said this, and here's another possible way to phrase it. And she developed a lovely knack for imitating me, so that I would, on occasion, simply pick up something she offered and stick it right into the manuscript.
You only better.
Yes, exactly. and then every now and then I would get a little meta in one of the book's 5,000 footnotes and simply acknowledge that I thought something, my copy editor thought otherwise. She said this, I'm going to go with it her way, or I decided I would stick with it my way. So, it's just a little sort of, I hope, a amusing sort of peek behind the curtain to see what was going on as the book was taking its final shape.
All right, last question. If you could wave a magic pen and make everyone on the planet writing do something differently, what would it be? Or do something your way?
Aside from the imposition of that notorious comma, I don't really think there is anything. I think that I like to be surprised by the writing that I'm reading. I like over and over and over again to read something and to see a piece of writing that shows me something or reveals something in a way that's the writer's and that isn't mine. There isn't one thing that everybody or even a lot of people do that bugs me. I mean, I can enjoy reading Shirley Jackson. I can enjoy reading Edith Wharton. I can enjoy reading Henry James with all his commas. I can enjoy reading every living author that I have ever worked with and adored. And they're all different, and they all should be different.
All right. I could ask you 1,000 more questions. We didn't even talk about semicolons, but Benjamin, pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Pamela.
Benjamin Dreyer's book is called Dreyer's English, An Utterly Correct Guide to Clarity and Style. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Thomas Mallon joins us appropriately from Washington to discuss his latest novel, Landfall. Tom, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I say appropriately because this book is what is commonly referred to, I guess, as the category as the Washington novel or political fiction. And I'm curious, what do those terms mean to you? And is that how you describe these books, think about them?
Yes, I mean, I've been avidly interested in politics since I was very small and read a lot of political fiction when I was younger. It was sort of the golden age of writers like Alan Drury and Fletcher Nebel and people like that. And they are political, and although they concern identifiable people, mixed in with fictional characters. And I'd say that one of the things that I try to do in historical fiction, or I should say don't do, is to advance a kind of agenda, a political agenda. If you look, say, at the historical novels of Gore Vidal, because these are also historical books, they're set a bit in the future, most of them set further back than this one. Vidal advances a thesis that he sometimes works quite hard about, America being a wayward empire and so forth. I don't really have a thesis about America. I'm trying to entertain. I'm trying maybe to make people be somewhat empathetic to figures that they have seen in the news and in history. And if I have any overarching idea, it's sort of to reverse that equation we have, that equation that says the personal is political, which was a kind of popular slogan for feminism and for various causes a couple of decades back. I think my view of things is more that the political is personal, that a lot of the political decisions that we see actually arise out of personal desires, animosities, compulsions, all of the things that make up characters in fiction that isn't political.
And yet, I mean, we're in such a politicized era. It's sort of hard to imagine writing about politics, even in fiction, without wanting to make some kind of argument.
Obviously, readers will have political reactions to these characters. They had strong feelings toward them when they were around a dozen years ago. And I think it is true. We have a cultural discourse now that's almost hate-based. There's so much anger. There was a time, I think it seems fanciful to me now, but even a decade ago, when I entertained the notion that historical fiction could bridge a divide for readers, because fiction that sees things from the points of view of different characters, it necessarily requires a certain empathy on the part of the novelist. And I've had people over the years say to me, I was surprised at how sympathetic I felt toward Nixon or toward Reagan or whoever it was, because I'm ferociously opposed to them politically. And I used to think that historical fiction might be useful, socially useful, for that very reason, that it could get people to soften their viewpoints a little bit, to be less hair trigger than they are. Recent developments have scotched that in my mind. I think that we are in such a bizarre and distressing political time now that those hopes seem pretty futile to me.
I remember on a panel about biography that Bob Caro, Robert Caro, Ron Chernow, and Blanche Hoyson Cook were on this panel. And someone asked, do you have to like a person in order to write a biography of that person? And they each said that because they had written biographies of people that weren't necessarily people you would consider likable. I mean, Blanche did. Luckily, she got, Eleanor Roosevelt. But Bob Caro, of course, had written about Robert Moses, and LBJ, who's complicated, and Ron Chernow had written about John Rockefeller. And their answer was, well, you have to at least maybe go in with
right.
some, you start off sort of thinking favorably, or at least having some kind of empathy. And I'm curious how you feel about your central characters. Do you need to feel a sense of identification or empathy toward them?
I think you have to. And if you don't feel it, you have to put yourself into a place where you're able to feel it. The more you think about it, the more you think about writing from their point of view. Some biographers have the experience where they turn against their subjects or become more favorably disposed toward them. I think that's true of Bob Caro if you look at the early LBJ versus the mature LBJ in Caro's books. But I think that the main advantage that the novelist has over the biographer is that the biographer has to be scrupulous with fact. The novelist doesn't to the same extent, and biographers often have to tangle themselves up in the subjunctive and say things like, well, at this point, it's not unreasonable to think that Bush might have thought, etc. Whereas if you're a novelist, you just go ahead and have him think it. There's no reason to write fiction if you can't play a little bit loose with the truth.
As a former history major, though I do enjoy reading historical fiction, that's where I get tripped up, which is, I'll be reading the Hilary Mantel and I'll want to know, okay, what exactly here happened? Just which part is factual because I don't have the timeline in front of me, or I don't remember the facts, or I didn't know them to begin with. Does that ever trouble you as a novelist, sort of like confusing readers, or you're just like, what the heck, their problem?
I've often had people say to me, I've learned so much history from your books. And I thank them for the compliment, but then I kind of recoil a little bit and I say, be careful though. In a couple of my books, I've had the disclaimer about how nouns always trump adjectives. And in historical fiction, that phrase, it's important to remember which is which. Fiction is the noun. Historical fiction is always fiction and never history. You try to get as many of the surface details right as possible. And I think I deviate from fact and the calendar and actuality rather less than some historical novelists are willing to do. But fundamentally, because you are making assumptions about people's motivations, their psychology, and you're inserting events, usually private events, that might have happened in between the public events that we know, you are always engaging in fiction. And I think for that reason, you have to be very wary as a reader. I'm all for truth in labeling. I mean, one of the things that troubles me is when I see memoirs that claim to be fact-based and so forth, but they have in fact deviated quite far from the person's actual experience. And they're really very much like what a couple of generations back would have been, first novels that were autobiographically based. I think that distinction between fiction and memoir, it's important to label those genres and for the reader to be cognizant of those labels while reading. And I think that's very much the case with historical fiction. You have to not make it a substitute for fiction.
And yet, it seems like so much fun, especially from the perspective of a journalist, where it's so bothersome. We have to stick so closely to the facts and make absolutely sure that everything is completely right and that we're not making assumptions. And yet you can say, we don't know what happened in the room, but let's make up what happened in that room.
Right. It ruins a writer for nonfiction. Once you've tried historical fiction, it's not just a slippery slope. You go careening down it. I mean, I have written nonfiction narrative. I've done reporting. And yet it has become very, very much more difficult for me to do it. I remember about 20 years ago, I wrote a long New Yorker piece that became a short book about a woman named Ruth Paine who had been innocently enmeshed in the Kennedy assassination. And it involved a tremendous amount of research, and it involved the thoroughgoing New Yorker fact-checking process. And I had enormous amounts of material. I had interviews. I had the Warren Commission transcripts. I had, the most documented event in some ways of the 20th century. And yet, I was trying to write a narrative reconstruction in places, and if I didn't have some kind of documentary evidence that Ruth was wearing, say, a pink blouse when she walked across the room, I couldn't have her in that blouse. I couldn't have her walk across the room unless I knew that for sure. And one of the things I found was that I was missing my fictional prerogatives. I wanted to be able to move the characters around in ways that the facts or the absence of facts and evidence constrain me from doing. So I do think it's a constant question, and it's much more difficult for writers of nonfiction.
You mentioned novels about Reagan, about Nixon. This book is about George W. Bush. You're sort of inching to what I think of as, and I don't like thinking about anything that occurred in my lifetime as history.
Mm-hmm.
That's all just very near present, but you're getting very close here to
the
present time.
And I know what's coming. I know the question is coming.
I'm not going to get to that yet. I will leave with that. But I guess my question is, I'm curious about how this works for you because, you're writing about Dewey and Truman, that's all speculation on your part. You're not that old. So, but this you lived through. So did you sort of during that time think someday I'll write about this, kind of take notes, think about what you might want to do with it? Or did you actually go back and research it as, recent history?
Oh, I definitely went back and researched it. Absolutely. And some of it was personal research, though, because I'd lived through it. I looked back to my diaries from this period and so forth and the way I was thinking about things back then. One of the things I've learned over the years is the further back you go with historical fiction, some people assume that it would be the harder it gets because the period is more remote, because you have to do more and more research. You have no living memory of it. I actually found that to be the opposite, if only from a reader's point of view, because the further you go back, the less the reader knows as well as the writer knows. And in some ways, I found it easier to write about the Civil War in an old novel of mine called Henry and Clara, which was about the couple in the balcony with the Lincolns on the night of the president's assassination. That was the novel I wrote before Dewey defeats Truman, which was set in the late 40s. And I didn't have any living memory of the Truman years. I was born in 51. But there were plenty of people around in 1997 when that book came out who did. Even my mother, who said, I think your heroine is a little fast for the time. And
Mom.
So, in some ways, it's the closer you are to the period, the more difficult it becomes because people have living memories of the intangibles, how people actually thought, how they spoke, how, they might have reacted to a situation. Whereas the further back you go, the less we really know about how people operated.
That's especially interesting given the fact that you chose George W. Bush, because before there was Trump and before there was Obama, both figures who are extremely polarizing, generally you either love them or despise them. There was George W. Bush, who similarly provoked extreme emotions. Like, people have lots and lots of feelings and thoughts about him still. We've forgotten it a little bit.
I wrote a short nonfiction piece on George H.W. Bush for The New Yorker after he died, and if I had any notion at all in it, my thesis was that he was the last president who was not actively despised by a large portion of the population, because I think you also had Clinton haters the way you had George W. Bush haters and Obama haters. And that, I think, is an interesting and slightly distressing phenomenon politically in the country. But I thought that the younger Bush, George W. Bush, was an interesting, complicated figure. I saw him as a man whose moods alternated very rapidly. I saw him with a lot of sides to him. Now, that's true of most people. But what I was most struck by was the quickness of the alternation, the very friendly, good old boy that people like to be in a room with, to a man who was quick to anger, quick to be frustrated, and so forth. And he had interested me for a very long time. The book opens in 1978 when he's running a losing race for Congress in West Texas. I was living there at the time. I had a job as an assistant professor of English at Texas Tech in Lubbock, and he was the congressional candidate that the Republicans were putting up. His father hadn't even been vice president yet. And he ran a good race. He ran a losing race. West Texas was still Democratic in those days. Most of Texas was. It hadn't really turned red yet. And I was aware of him. I can remember his commercials on my black and white TV, riding around in a little pickup truck with his new wife, Laura. And so he was somebody that I was aware of, I think, a little earlier than most people were. And he did interest me. My editor, Dan Frank, who has been with me for all of these political novels, after I had written the one about Watergate and after Finale, which was the Reagan book, he was sort of looking at me like, what's next? And Clinton came up. And Clinton's a very complicated man, very interesting, but he didn't seem mysterious to me. I think the compartments that we always talk about with Clinton, they were evident to me. And I think you wanted an element of mystery. And I did find some of that in George W. Bush, his relations with his parents, his operation with the people who were around him. And so he didn't bore me, I'll say that.
George W. Bush has always kind of fascinated me, I guess, because of that idea of mystery, that the person that he was before he became president seems so very different from the person he was as president, and then again from his post-presidency. And people that I know who have disagreed with him politically, disagree with him on everything, but have subsequently got to know him, talk about him as this absolutely lovely, charming, and intelligent person.
I think that's true. One of the chief interpreters of George W. Bush for the American public is Michelle Obama, who seems especially fond of him.
Right,
and
with
goes
the
out
little
of her
mint
way.
exchanges.
Right, and goes out of her way, really to talk about him as a wonderful person. That's how she sees him. At a certain point, if you have people who are ferociously against somebody politically, as many people were against George W. Bush, you're not going to bring them around to making those kinds of allowances. But I think typically we have made those kinds of allowances for presidents, and I think we demonize them at our peril, although current circumstances, I find,
we'll get there.
make it very difficult not to. Okay. But I think that he had a background that was really very interesting. He was the scion of this well-established political family, these somewhat blue-blooded wasps and so forth. And yet he was also genuinely a Texan. That was where his formative years were spent. He didn't sound anything like his father. Finally, he didn't think anything like his father. In many respects, he was much more his mother's son. His mother was slow to forgive people, quick to anger, very witty, very smart, somebody who managed her public image very expertly. I think she was quite happy that a large part of the public and press viewed her as this, matronly grandmother wearing pearls and so forth, this sort of friendly dowager, when she was a much sharper, tougher character than that. Laura Bush, very smart, very serene, very cultivated person who found herself caught up in this political whirlwind that she never expected to be in. A lot of political people, as well as characters in political novels, are in that situation. They find themselves in circumstances they never could have predicted, never expected, in many cases actively didn't want. Mrs. Bush certainly did not want to be a political wife, and it was considered very unlikely that George W. was going to go back into politics after that losing congressional race. All the family money was on Jeb, his brother, going into it. And so things happen like that, and that's fodder for novelists too.
So when you say that George W. Bush was a mystery and therefore interesting, do you, as part of your job, do you see it, or the fun and excitement as a novelist of solving that mystery in your own way, trying to say, okay, this is my version of him that explains that?
Yes, and I think you put it out there as a speculative version, one that's more speculative than a biographer's interpretation. And there have been presidents at the heart of these three books of mine, and I think I've tried to do the same thing for all three of them. I got inside Nixon's head a lot and was somewhat appalled at how comfortable I felt being in there. I don't know what that said about me, but Nixon was a tremendously bifurcated character, a man of real skill, real preparation for the office. Nobody ever thought, Nixon was dumb, but he was complicated. And if you were for him, he would break your heart again and again. He was always breaking his own heart, and circumstances were. The only one that I had to approach from a very different way was Reagan.
Because he was not complicated?
No, I think he was, of the three, I think he was the most mysterious and in some ways the most unfathomable. But when I started to write about him, I experienced very much what Edmund Morris experienced when he wrote Dutch, that he couldn't inhabit him in a way. There was something spooky about him. And so in his case, he resorted to fictional techniques that were very uneasily applied to biography. In my case, I realized that except for the very end of the book, I was going to see Reagan entirely from the points of view of the people around him who spent a lot of energy trying to figure him out.
All right, you've spent this entire conversation trying to talk about Donald Trump. I'm not going to stop you anymore. Just final question, could you imagine yourself writing a Trump novel?
No. And I have taken a public pledge not to. I did a piece in The New Yorker in 2016 called Presumptive, which was about how a novelist might have turned the race between Trump and Clinton into fiction. And like everybody else, I expected Trump to lose. And I talked about how you would do that just for the campaign. But the idea of writing about him as a central figure would be impossible to me, I think, for a number of reasons. First off, I'm just too repelled by him. And second, I don't think he has the even two dimensions that are required by a character in fiction, a main character in fiction, let alone the three dimensions that one hopes for. And people have been asking me this now that this book is on Bush is out and finished. And my answer is really, I just hope to survive this presidency. I have no hopes of or plans of chronicling it.
Well, I guess one thing that has worked in your favor is that people currently who were critical of George W. Bush feel a sense of nostalgia now for those years. So it will perhaps lead them to be more open.
This book, in many respects, this book is very critical of George W. Bush. This is by no means Valentine's or hagiography. But I do think what you're talking about is very true, that people are I think, ready to be more empathetic toward any past president. I mean, Trump has been a bonanza for every single man who occupied the office before him. He's making Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan look like, Churchill and Teddy Roosevelt. And so I think that does operate on recent history as well. And I do hope that people can view this in all the ways we've been talking about as speculative and a different lens through which to view the history that they've lived through and the politics that they're living in our own day.
All right. Well, a trip back to the early aughts with Landfall by Thomas Mallon. Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Pamela. I enjoyed it.
Joining us now to talk about what's going on in the publishing world, Alexandra Alter, our intrepid publishing reporter. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, so this week you've been busy.
Yeah, I actually haven't been on for a few weeks because I've been covering all these scandals. I was just hoping for a week without a scandal so that I could come on and talk about something more pleasant. But it's been a really intense period of news in the publishing world. First, we had, a young adult author withdrawing her book after facing criticism online. The book wasn't even due out for a few months, but she decided to cancel it. That's Amelie Wenzel. And the book was Blood Air. And that was just a bunch of criticism on Twitter and elsewhere, sort of causing her to panic and withdraw the book. That was a couple weeks ago when I was off. And then last week we had the questions surrounding Jill Abramson's book, Merchant of Truth. She's, of course, the former executive editor of the New York Times. And readers had noticed overlapping passages between her book and previous reporting. And it was particularly, I think, an intense discussion because the purpose and the point of her book was sort of journalistic ethics and standards. So a lot of people were questioning, how she went about her own reporting and writing. And then this week, I was looking at new questions about Dan Mallory, who is the author of the best-selling thriller The Woman in the Window. And there was, of course, an explosive expose in the New Yorker about Mr. Mallory that looked at his history as an editor at William Morrow and other houses where he had repeatedly misrepresented his past and fabricated this family tragedy and feigned fatal illnesses and sort of revealed the depth of his deception in his professional life. It did go into the genesis of the book, but it didn't look at any kind of questions or problems with the book itself, which is, of course, a novel. There's been a lot of scrutiny of him since, and apparently, in addition to, various sources that he has cited for inspiration, there is another book that was extremely similar to his book, The Woman in the Window, and that was Saving April, which was published in March of 2016, several months before Mr. Mallory sold his novel. He says he started drafting the outline of his book well before her book was published, and it's entirely possible that people can arrive at plot points independently, particularly in genre fiction where there's certain tropes that are familiar, like an unreliable female narrator or the victim who turns out to be the perpetrator. And it just sort of opened up this whole discussion and can of worms about plagiarism in fiction and how difficult it is to demonstrate how, ideas and plots can't really be copyrighted the same way that specific characters or specific passages of language can be. So I think it's interesting. There have been a few high-profile copyright lawsuits that have been dismissed by courts. The author of the novel that came out first has no intention of pursuing legal action, but she did say that she was disappointed because she says it's led some readers to misjudge her work, not realizing that it came out first.
In the wake of the initial expose in The New Yorker that focused not so much on plagiarism, although it did talk a little bit about him getting some
ideas from movies and things. Yeah, absolutely.
Copycat, but was more about sort of his post-publishing the book and pre-publishing the book kind of behavior and misbehavior. He issued a statement, I think it was online, sort of saying, he has bipolar 2 and various mea culpas on that front. Did he comment on this most recent?
No, he didn't comment. His publisher provided a comment, and he didn't want to comment specifically for our story. He did a ton of publicity for the book. The book has been a huge bestseller for William Morrow. There's a movie coming out this fall. The paperback's coming out next month. There's another book that he's working on. And I think, there's been a question in publishing of whether this would have any impact on how readers approach the material. And in a way, a lot of people have thrown up their hands and said, why does it really matter? It's fiction. Obviously, he's a good storyteller if he's fabricated all of these details from his past. And it's not the same as somebody who has fabricated in a nonfiction book or, taken exact language from somebody. So I don't think readers are going to connect necessarily his personal history and past with the book, at least if sales are an indication.
I guess an ethical issue more than a legal one.
Exactly.
Perhaps an artistic one, but that depends on readers' tastes. So
I agree, yes.
All right, Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles, Tina Jordan, and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, let's start with you, John. What are you reading?
I'm reading a novel called The Nun from a very long time ago by Denis Diderot, the philosopher, novelist, art critic, maybe most famously encyclopedist. I just read and posted an interview recently on the website about a new biography of Diderot by a scholar named Andrew Curran, which got me interested in him more granularly than I had been in the past, and I'd never read, maybe aside from a few brief stretches of his philosophy, anything significant. So I picked up The Nun. It was made into a movie in the 60s, which I haven't seen.
Scandalous novel.
Well, at the time, for sure. Although it was published, like many things that he wrote, it was published pretty sure after he was dead. But it's about a nun in the 18th century, a young teenage girl who's sent to a convent because she, it turns out, and this is not really a spoiler, that she is illegitimate. And so her parents, her mother, doesn't want to leave her anything. Her existence is scandalous to the mother, and so she says, this is really the only way you're going to get through life in any meaningful way. And the girl is a good person, but she's not really all that faithful, and she doesn't believe in the vows she's taking, and so she's existentially a little troubled by this. And then once she's in the convent, she's also tortured emotionally and occasionally borderline physically by the other nuns who pick on her and her mother superior who knows that she's not, her heart's not in it. And then eventually at the point I'm at, which is about 2/3 of the way through the book, she's transferred to a nunnery with a much more friendly mother superior, maybe to the point that there will be some erotic elements that come into play, both subconscious and consciously.
Spoiler alert, that is true.
Greg has
Ruined
seen the movie.
For everyone.
It's terrific. It's not, given that it's a couple hundred years old, you never know what you're going to get with a classic like that, how dry or propulsive it will be. And it's a very good psychological portrait, and I'm finding it a bit of a page turner.
All right, Greg, we want to ruin your book. What are you reading?
The Immigrant and the University by an author I had not heard of named Karen Sveen. That's Sveen. She's a poet and an essayist, but she spent a year at Berkeley several years ago as a scholar in residence. And while she was there, she got kind of obsessed with one of the Berkeley founders. His name is Peter Sater, Sather, who was himself a Norwegian immigrant. And the famous Campanile, the bell tower on Berkeley's campus, is the Sater Tower. And the famous front gates that you walk through into Berkeley are the Sater gates. And so she said, well, who is this guy? And she started looking, and there was nothing on him. Despite this very kind of public naming, she couldn't find any record of his life, of where he had come from. And so although she's not a historian or a biographer, she became very obsessed and wrote this book kind of picking up the pieces, going back and tracking him down. And
when did he live, roughly?
He was born in the early 19th century, 1810, on a farm in Norway. His older brother inherited the farm and made him just a clerk there, but he had this great mind for numbers. He impregnated a girl in Norway and kind of left in disgrace to come to America, where he established himself as a banker, first in New York and then out in San Francisco, became very successful. So it's this whole story of Norwegian immigration and entrepreneurialism. And this guy just kind of lost to history because he was a very private person, although he had a very public life. And so she writes this thing, but again, from the mind of a poet and an essayist. It's beautifully written and beautifully translated by Barbara Haviland, who does a lot of translation from the Scandinavian. I'll read you a very brief paragraph where she's kind of setting the scene of arriving at Berkeley as the scholar in residence. But she's also very smart on kind of recreating a life when there's not a lot of material there. So it's a lot about the enterprise itself of writing biography. Here's the scene setting coming into Berkeley. California is as far west as you can go without ending up in the far east, and the physical effects of traveling such a long distance are palpable. I was still jangling inside well after landing, and the feeling of being airborne had not yet left me when I drove away from the airport outside of San Francisco in a minibus, setting out on the last leg of my journey to Berkeley. This took me over the enormous bay lying inland from the Golden Gate on the thundering Bay Bridge, as high at its midpoint as a mountain ridge, and overlooking shimmering hills, blue and silent. The sun was descending into the Pacific Ocean, red and alarmingly big, appearing to swell as it sank. White sailboats bobbed in the bay, and a steady stream of freighters slipped through the Golden Gate Strait, heading for the port of Oakland, where long-legged container cranes waded in the water like huge birds.
I guess my spoiler is that the sun set. It did go down. Tina, what about you?
So I'm reading a cancer memoir called The Unwinding of the Miracle by Julie Yip Williams. It's published posthumously. She died last March, I believe. She kept a blog, which I actually read and followed because she was the friend of a friend. She was 37 years old when she ended up in the ER one weekend with stomach pains and nausea. And instead of being told she had an ulcer or whatever she expected, she was told she had stage 4 colon cancer. So she started almost immediately writing a blog. And it was very raw. It was very honest. She was angry. She was upfront about her bad behavior. She was grappling with the idea that here she was, mother of 2 very young children. She was going to die. And it was so unvarnished and so honest. I mean, I'm not surprised that it became a book. It's interesting to see how it became a book, though, as someone who followed the blog pretty much through the 5 or 6 years that it was ongoing, to see how they took all that material and stitched a book together out of it.
So it is very much straight from the contents are from the blog.
The contents are from the blog, rearranged. There's an afterword by her husband. But I want to read you, the first chapter is now something that actually came from near the end of the blog. And it was written in the form of a letter to her 2 daughters. And she says, "You'll be deprived of a mother. As your mother, I wish I could protect you from the pain. But also as your mother, I want you to feel the pain, to live it, embrace it, and then learn from it. Be stronger people because of it, for you know that you will carry my strength within you. Be more compassionate because of it. Empathize with those who suffer. Rejoice in life and all its beauty because of it. Live with special zest and zeal for me. Be grateful in a way that only someone who lost her mother so early can, in your understanding of the precariousness and preciousness of life. This is my challenge to you, my sweet girls, to take an ugly tragedy and transform it into a source of beauty, love, strength, courage, and wisdom.
I literally have tears in my eyes.
No, that's so unbearable. It's definitely on my pile of books to read.
It's hard to read this book, but it's also she herself said both, and this blog post is in the book, like she was looking for guidance on how to die. When Breath Became Air came out, she didn't read it at first because it was a little too, on the nose for her. But as her own death approached, she decided to read it. And she was like, where's the rest of it? Because there's nothing about the last 8 months of his life. And she really wanted someone to help her figure this out. Like, how should a person die? But the thing that, and this is going to sound corny, but the thing that she never lost sight of was,
how should a person live?
How should a person live? And how do you find joy in the everyday, even when you know that you're going to live a matter of months, a matter of days, whatever? I highly recommend it.
Pamela, you're going to make us cry.
No, I'll spare you. I just finished a book while I'm reading another book. And the reason for this, I think I mentioned on an earlier podcast, is my main book is Robert Caro's Master of the Senate, which is the third volume in his LBJ biography. There are now 4. There's a 5th one to come, hopefully, sooner rather than later. And this one, most people say of the first 4 is kind of the masterpiece. And I'd read the first 2 back in high school. So it's been a long time. And it's interesting to read the third installment of a book when you can hardly remember the first 2. His entry into the book is a really genius way to begin, which is with a brief, just about 100 pages overview of the history of the Senate. Because we all know Robert Caro is interested in power, and in this instance, it's power in the Senate. So he gives you a history of the institution, all the stuff that all of us learned at some point in elementary school and again in junior high and again in high school and promptly forgot and, baffles us still. But the reasons why the Senate was created with 6-year terms that rotate on a one-third basis so that every 2 years you reelect 1/3 of the Senate, why that is, why that's different from the House, and how the Senate went from being this very august institution with really great minds to being for a very long time an institution of stalemate and sort of second-rate thought, second-rate leaders, and the particular developments that were not in the Constitution, but that came to be over time that led to this, primarily seniority, the rule of seniority, and secondly, the filibuster. And then a bunch of sort of procedural things that eventually kind of caused the Senate to calcify. And when you read this history, he basically gives you, a history from the founding up to 1949 when Lyndon Baines Johnson entered the Senate as a junior senator from Texas, tells you this history with the Senate at its center, which is not a common way for us to think about history, whether we're reading it from the sort of viewpoint of a president or from the viewpoint of a social or cultural history. This is a really different way to look at it. And it's pretty damning because you realize, it's quite possible that World War II would not have happened had it not been for the intense isolationism of the Senate and the fact that they voted against the League of Nations. And you start thinking about alternate histories of like what would have happened had the League of Nations passed, had the Senate not blocked it. And you think about what would have happened for those who've read David McCullough's biography of Truman and all of the incredible reforms that Truman attempted to pass had the Senate not blocked all of those reforms. It's this sort of accumulation in what might have been had the Senate been more effective. And it's a brilliant way to set up this LBJ in the Senate biography, because what we know is that LBJ became perhaps the most effective senator of the 20th century. I think it probably perhaps isn't necessary. He was. And what that did to the institution, how he was able to take a place that had essentially become obstructionist to the forces of progress and change, and to turn that around and to do it coming from such an unlikely place himself. This was a small town, very corrupt politician who got there, Southerner, not a person who you would expect to crusade for racial justice. And so that's the setup. And you go through that, and it's really powerful. The book is 1,000 pages, but I don't think it's going to take me that long to read, because it really does move along. And he goes almost immediately into Johnson's really repulsive physical habits. You know, the fact that he scratched himself in places that shouldn't be scratched in public, and picked his nose, and
Didn't
really
he conduct meetings while he was sitting on the toilet?
Yes, he did.
Yes,
he did.
And very deliberately so. It was a power move.
It was a humiliating thing for the people
It was all about
he was meeting.
power, you know, and he chose the victims for that, you know, very carefully. It was the attractive young women in his office. It was the, you know, fastidious young assistant who he wanted to kind of put in his place. So the pacing is excellent. And yet it's a very heavy book. So at the same time that I'm reading that, I'm really going to have a train, you know, standing in line kind of book. And so this week it was a book that Charles Finch and Tina both recommended, of the thrillers of the season, which was Joanne Charney's For As Long As We Both Shall Live. Mm-hmm. It's got a nice set of bloody wedding rings on the cover. And it's a domestic thriller, really well done. You know, I still consider myself an amateur in this genre, so I am constantly surprised, and I never see it coming. And and the setup of this one I thought was very clever. Tina, you can completely disabuse me of the idea that this is original, but it felt original to me. Well, this part, not so much. It starts off with, okay, you know who's guilty. You know that he did. You don't necessarily know why, but you've got a good sense. What this guy did was he killed his first wife, and then he killed his second wife. And you're on page 50 by the time you know that. And then you know, okay, there's 200 more pages to this thing, so that can't all be it. And the rest of the book is kind of figuring out, okay, what don't we know about this scenario? I don't know, Tina, what did you make of it?
I loved it, and I thought it was an original setup. They're on a hike, you know, he and his second wife, and she falls off a cliff into the river below.
A cliffhanger.
Right. Or does she?
Not quite.
Right.
She's presumed dead.
She's
Charles
presumed to be
said
dead.
in his review.
Right. No one can, there's no way she could have lived. Or is there?
Right. So we won't spoil anything for our listeners, despite, Greg, your desire for such things. Greg, tell us what you read.
The Immigrant and the University by Karen Sveen.
Tina?
The Unwinding of the Miracle by Julie Yip Williams.
And John?
The Nun by Diderot.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.